Welcome to Masters of Product Management, a show that gives you real-world techniques and cutting-edge strategies to learn, apply, and succeed in product management. Now, here's the master himself, Stephen Haines.
How many times have you, as product guys, had to either validate dimensions of your business case or your launch plan, or perhaps even confirm the context of a user story for a product before it's got to get out to market? And from my point of view, it isn't that easy. And most product managers know that we don't have as much information or customer insights as many as we need. And sometimes those insights get missed. And as we've learned at Sequent Learning Networks, when product managers and marketers they're scurrying around and, trying to figure out how do we get a validation? How do we really talk to a customer? And when those things happen, it's like, I call it just-in-time research or just-in-time insight. And that is, if we're just trying to get those, we're really not necessarily listening in the way that we need to listen, and we may be missing important clues. And what that does is that can expose the business to some undue risk. And maybe, we have to create a value proposition, and a value proposition is written from the customer's point of view. And therefore, if we don't understand what the customer values, or we think we do, but it misses the mark, bad things generally happen. And that's a problem. So I was talking about this topic with my professional colleague, Nis Fromm, and he mentioned that there are solutions that are available to product managers. And I wanted to bring him on the show to share his insights. So Nis is the co-founder and head of content at Alpha, and his articles I know have been published in Forbes and UX Magazine and NextWeb, and you ought to take a look at some of those. But what Alpha does is it's an on-demand user insights platform, and it's literally powered thousands of experiments for product guys who work in big companies, and those are the people who want to move faster. So Nis, really, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you, Stephen, for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's great. Now, I know for a fact that our listeners are really eager to know what you might see as a key issue. These are product managers and what they face today when it comes to things like customer-oriented research and analysis.
Yeah, Stephen, I think you've kind of summed it up pretty well there, in that I don't think these tasks have ever been easy. Creating a user story, validating assumptions. I don't think that's ever been easy, but I definitely believe that it's been getting more difficult over the years as different changes, and there's so many variables. Something we talk about is you could be building an app for a mobile phone, and if that project takes 3 to 6 months to build, that mobile operating system could already be on the next iteration, the next version before you release your app. So there's all these interdependencies going on that makes it really difficult to validate a user story before you build a project. So what we see companies doing is shifting, and I'm sure you've talked about this, from waterfall to agile, and that means that the decision making and the data needed for those decisions also has to switch from waterfall to agile. So instead of making all the decisions upfront before a project, these decisions need to be made throughout the project. So that data needs to be generated throughout the project as well. And that's really what we're seeing a lot of.
So it's almost like near real time analysis, and that the product guys need to literally think with greater agility to literally match what it is that has to happen so that the stories are as current as necessary. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, summed it up in his recent letter to shareholders really well. He called it day 2 versus day 1 organizations, Amazon being a day 1 organization, where they execute on high velocity decision making, where he said large companies are typically good at making perfect decisions too late, whereas Amazon tries to make reasonably good decisions much quicker and hope that they can iterate multiple times before their competition even makes a decision once for the first time.
Well, that's a pretty tall order. I mean, you got to have a lot of hands on deck to do that. How does a company do that? How do they get ahead of that curve?
Yeah, well, it's obviously helpful if you have a CEO who believes in that sort of approach, and you have that top down investment, and that's always the best case scenario, I would say, but that's not necessarily typical. So you need that sort of mindset and those sort of incentive structures in place. And if you don't have that, it's definitely possible, but it's difficult. And it does take quite a bit of initiative from, folks in the trenches.
Mm-hmm. Well, how do people, so as you're saying this, I'm thinking about how do you stay ahead of the curve, right? Because you get involved in sort of this discovery activity, and then all of a sudden you got to go and get something built while who's going to do the ongoing discovery while stuff gets built and validated? How do companies deal with that dynamic?
Yeah, so we've seen a lot of different approaches. Obviously, you have more of the siloed approach where you might have a business or product manager who's responsible and accountable for the decisions, and they might throw requests over the fence to some sort of consumer insights team. They'll do their work and they'll come back with data however long later, and then the business or product leader then has to make a decision with that data. We've seen a lot of context lost in those sort of situations, and the cadences don't always line up because you might have slack with the development team that needs to do something now, and they don't have the data to make that decision. So, there are a variety of different approaches out there. And what we've seen work here at Alpha is when the product manager has the capability to ask a question and in somewhat real time, or at least on demand, get insights into their decisions every single day.
You're listening to Masters of Product Management with Stephen Haines from Sequent Learning Networks, sequentlearning.com.
In some of the diagnostics that we do at Sequent, we have heard that as part and parcel to what it is that you're saying is that they have to do some experiments and things like that. And it is a matter of speed, and it is a matter of cadences. So I still can't get my brain around how they fit it in. It's almost like there's so many undercurrents going on at the same time, and it conjures up that image, and in my desk reference book, I have this picture of this product manager's like juggling everything and doing all these things, and they can't even, it's almost like they're swimming up a stream, and they're, in a canoe that might capsize. I mean, how do you literally get these people to really get their hands around this stuff and make a better decision? I know it sounds like it's really interesting imagery, isn't it? Like, I'm running up the screen.
Yeah. It's definitely a challenge, and I don't think there's a silver bullet there. However, anytime you can shorten the iteration cycles, you're moving along the spectrum toward, being able to compete with the likes of Amazon or Uber, Netflix, and the companies that, we typically think of that move fast and disrupt their industries repeatedly. Mm-hmm. So, if you can go from, taking 3 months to make a decision down to 2 days, you can iterate many, many times within that 3 months. What you would have done, taken one decision, now you're making 12 to 15, and you're iterating and making hopefully smarter, optimized decisions each time. So that's really what it comes down to, is shortening those iteration cycles and figuring out what are the blockers, what's causing congestion, and how to circumvent that.
Well, all right. I hear that, and I think that is really outstanding. Now, maybe there are some product people who can operate in that environment where that kind of velocity is sustainable. But there are other companies, and our listeners come from a broad swath of industries and sizes of companies. And the bigger the company and the more complex, notwithstanding companies maybe like a Salesforce or an Amazon, but other companies where there's a lot more complexity and things seem to move a little bit slower, maybe sometimes a lot slower. What kind of advice could we offer to those people?
Yeah, so there's definitely that I wouldn't even say those are the rare instances. I would say those are actually, the majority of the cases. Something we primarily work with organizations, the Fortune 100, Fortune 500, and there's a lot of frustration coming from them about reading, some of the practices that are prevalent in startups and in software companies, and saying that doesn't really apply here. And they're right, for a variety of reasons. It doesn't apply there. There are industry regulations, HIPAA compliance laws, and financial services. I know there's many different regulations as well. They can't necessarily just launch something out to the market and then iterate on it. It doesn't work that way. It's either illegal, it could ruin their brand reputation. There's a lot of problems. So, we work with these organizations to find and develop an approach that really works for them. So I'll just give you one example. Instead of putting a live engineered product in the market, our platform enables these product teams to create interactive prototypes. They're clickable. Users will know that they're a prototype. They know it's not a live product. Obviously, they didn't download it from the App Store and they didn't buy it off a shelf in a Walmart. But they know it's an interactive prototype. But even that is substantially better than acting on no data. If you get that reaction to a prototype, that's substantially better than, just having an opinion, and that's substantially better than just asking users to read a survey and self-report whether or not they would take an action in the future. So, that's just one instance of how we work with large organizations to really circumvent the obstacles that they have and build a process that really makes sense for their specific use cases.
Right. When I used to work at Oracle, and we were these were enterprise apps that we were working on, and that we created these prototypical models. I mean, they were non-working user interface designs that allowed the experience to be felt by a customer, even though there was nothing at the back end. And we found those to be incredible. And those, those were more than a decade ago that those were being used. But,
yeah.
And part and parcel to that, though, is this whole entire user experience. And it's the topic of everything I read. It's almost like it's coming at us like a fire hose. But what can we do with respect to prototypes and other things and some additional customer research? What is it, like this one piece of advice that you could offer product managers to be more effective in this area?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of companies have realized that actually user experience can be a competitive advantage. Typically, you would have thought, the value proposition or the supply chain or, whatever it is delivered, some sort of efficiency or effectiveness that was the competitive advantage. And what I urge, your listeners to consider is whether actually user experience can be a competitive advantage. And if you think about it that way, I think that, you can justify making the necessary investments in making an experience, even if the end product and the end value proposition is the same, an experience that is more enjoyable, that is easier to use, that lets your users onboard faster, lets them get to the value proposition faster. I think that in of itself is actually an advantage that your listeners could take and could use against the competition.
You're listening to Masters of Product Management with Stephen Haines from Sequent Learning Networks. sequentlearning.com.
That's really amazingly good feedback and good suggestions. And what's interesting as well, I mean, I'm a customer of companies and you're a customer of companies. And I think that if I'm any barometer of user experiences, I think that companies are missing the boat in a lot of different areas. And I'm not intending to be overly critical, because I think that companies and product people need to really, I mean, I know that speed is the name of the game, but maybe they need to moderate the speed sufficiently to really, really understand what experience they are trying to offer and what value proposition they are trying to project. Because in some cases, I think they still are missing the boat. And again, not with no data behind this, my general sense is that the experience is being missed more often than not.
Yeah, I think you can have the reverse problem as well to what we just talked about, which is where some organizations only focus on the iteration, the speed, and what the experience is without thinking about the larger business cases and what the actual value of what they're delivering is. So it's definitely it's a balance. It's not there's not one product management process that is superior and works for everyone. It's really a balance. And I know you talk about and you write about all the time about, taking that business and that strategy into consideration. And that's where it all needs to begin. And I totally agree with that.
That's really great. And all of this stuff, I mean, we could probably talk about this for hours and hours and hours, but, there's a couple of things, if I'm able to distill some of these things, it really is important still to validate, and to moderate speed and to make decisions at the speed of the market so that you could achieve the competitive advantage and deliver a value proposition that's better than anybody else. And I think that really is the bottom line. And with this, I want to thank you for sharing some of these insights and being on the show. These are important for product managers and other people who need to have the best information about current perspective on customers and on their markets, again, so they can make optimal business decisions on behalf of their products and their companies. And I hope you'll agree And perhaps you'll join me next time on Masters of Product Management. See you next time.
This has been Masters of Product Management with Stephen Haines, but it doesn't end there. Just visit sequentbusiness.net to gain access to all of our shows and subscribe. That way you'll never miss an episode. It's all there at sequentbusiness.net. We'll talk to you next time on Masters of Product Management. Learn, apply, and succeed. Sequentlearning.com